So we're going to switch over to live on Facebook, which is kept on there for a year, just so you know.
Okay.
And I'm sharing to a group. So welcome to the Book Love Foundation. Clint, I want you to know, for one, we have over 1,300 teachers and ed leaders from 15 countries with us this summer. And although many of them don't join live, they do go back and watch this later. So it's something that we give as a kind of a way to raise money for the foundation, but also as a way to highlight things that we think are important. And one of those is poetry. We read a teacher's collection of poetry last year, and when I found Counting Descent and fell in love, not only because so much of it is Boston, and I live in North Conway, so both my kids went to Boston College. I've spent so many hours down there, and there's like the one on the bridge on the way over to Cambridge. There's so many poems that resonated with place. There's also a sense of such incredible craft here. And so I welcome you to the week of poetry, where we're going to talk to a lot of poets, but everyone in the book club is reading your collection. So I hope you might start by reading us one poem.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone in the book club for spending time with the work. It means a lot, and I'm very grateful. I thought I would read it's been a while since I've read from this book. I've been in sort of my nonfiction space with the release of my newest book. And so this will be a nice treat to sort of revisit these old friends. But I'll read from the title poem of the book. Counting Descent. My grandfather is a quarter century older than his right to vote and 2 decades younger than the president who signed the paper that made it so. He married my grandmother when they were 4 years younger than I am now, and were twice as sure about each other as I've ever been about most things. They had 6 children separated by 9 years, 3 cities, and 1 Mason-Dixon line. There were twice as many boys as girls, but half as many bedrooms as children, which most days didn't matter because poor ain't poor unless you name it so. And kids prefer playing to counting, so there was never much time to wallow in anything but laughter. My mother was the 3rd oldest, or the 4th youngest, depending on who you asked. She was born on a federal holiday, which my grandmother was thankful for. Said the good Lord only got 1 day off when he built the world, so 1 day is all she needed too. Mom says Pops was persistent, wouldn't give up when he asked if he could take her down the street to get some coffee, which back then cost $2 less than it does now. Now, Mom is trying to stop drinking coffee, but she still loves Pops. They've been married for 31 years and have 3 kids who are 6 years and 1,517 miles apart. My birth took 12 hours and 43 minutes, which is probably because my head is 5 times too big. Mom said that my head was big because I needed enough room to read all the books in the library, which seemed like infinity, even though I didn't really know what infinity meant. But I heard my teacher say it once when she talked about the universe, and books felt like the universe to me. I was pretty good at math too, until about 5th grade when they started putting numbers and letters together, which didn't make much sense. My brother is 70 months younger than me, but is taller and knows more about numbers, so it doesn't always feel like this is true. My sister is 24 years of loyal and 8 years of best friend. I am the oldest of 3, but maybe the most naive. I still believe that we can build this world into something new, someplace where I can live past 25 and it's not a cause for celebration, because these days I celebrate every breath. Tried to start counting them so I wouldn't take each one for granted. I wish I could give my breath to the boys who've had theirs taken, but I've stopped counting because it feels like there are too many boys and not enough breath to go around.
Wow. One of the things I noticed in your book is you say Counting Descent is written after Alan Michael Parker. In fact, there's a whole list at the end of after. Can you say what that means?
Yeah, so after is a way of saying that something in the poem was inspired by or shaped by, animated by, to varying degrees, a poem or the work of another person. So Alan Michael Parker is a professor at Davidson College, and he was my professor at Davidson College. He was my writing and poetry professor. And he has, I can't remember where the book is from, but he has a poem that uses the same sort of framework and the same sort of conceit around numbers and counting and family. I think it's called Family Numbers. Um, and and I remember reading that poem from his collection and being so struck by that idea and that sort of that way of using numbers and putting it in conversation with family and sort of situating ourselves in this uh, with both within lineage but also in this sort of mathematical construct. And I just thought it was so interesting and so creative. And I find that I do my best work when I'm reading the work of other poets. You know, I write my best poems when I'm reading the work of other poets. And I was reading this collection, and oftentimes when I write a poem, it will be after I read a poem or a line or a word in somebody else's work that sort of uh, serves as a catalyst for something in me, that evokes something in me. And I kind of put the book down and I jot some notes down. I have an iPhone full of a notes section with all sorts of words and phrases and ideas that are inspired by so much of what I'm reading. And so yeah, after is just a way of saying, sort of giving a nod to the person who, you know, created the work that inspired a particular poem.
I think that's a wonderful, I have my students do that as well. A wonderful way to acknowledge that the inspiration came from somewhere. And sometimes it is form and sometimes it is the idea or like
Mhm,
the way you said the conceit, the idea that if you look at your family through this lens of numbers, and actually in the collection here there are several that involve numbers. I found that really
mhm,
interesting. I was looking at it as something that you repeat in your form. The idea of the cardboard box that is 10
mhm,
and it counts down. You know, you have, I just think it's interesting to look at a collection and then you have, I don't know, I think I wrote down 4 or 5 that involve numbers. You have several odes.
mhm.
You have this repeating what the ocean said, what the window said to the black boy, what the, and what I'm curious about is how do you then put it together into a collection? You have this, you know, like where do they fall? How do you decide which goes where?
Yeah, it's its own sort of creative process. Like after the poems are written, in many ways, you are figuring out in what ways each poem is in conversation with another, which poems are building on one another, which poems are um, will you know you can have a poem that comes after like you can read a poem in isolation and it exists as that poem, but you can read a poem and then have another poem that comes after it that almost reshapes and recalibrates the way you understood the first poem, right? And so part of it is thinking about not each poem as a sort of singular entity or as if it exists on its own island, or even its own archipelago, but like these are all pieces that you are putting together that, when put in specific orders, shape the way that each poem is understood and received by the reader. And so for me, you know, part of it is trying to figure out what is the sort of narrative arc you want the book to, if you want the book to have a narrative arc, what sort of narrative arc you want the book to have. And I think for me, part of what I wanted the book to reflect, and I think it does to an extent, or I hope it does, is the way that my sort of sensibilities were shifting over the course of writing this book, and how what was happening in the world um, shaped the way that I created art, and how I sort of situated my own identity in relation to this sort of ever changing world. Which is to say, I started this poetry collection. I started writing it in probably in 2014, after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson,
Mhm.
and so much of the first a sort of year of writing those poems was animated largely by anger and fear and um, and just a sense of um, this idea that my writing was being governed from a place of anger and fear and contempt, um, and I think it was important for me to write into those spaces, because it was helping me process and make sense of so much of this sort of early iteration of Black Lives Matter movement, um, and so much of the violence that we were seeing manifest itself on our screens and on our television, on our phones. And I was sort of writing into this space of of being confronted with this sort of these images, um, in what felt like an unceasing way, and then putting that in conversation with my own childhood, my own experience, my own questions about this country and how I fit into it. And I think part of what happened halfway through is that I was like, well, I want to write this book that's a sort of coming of age story of Black life, or the life of one Black child in this country. Um, but I also don't want to fall into the trap of making it seem as if Blackness, or Black childhood, or Black coming of age is singularly defined by fear, or singularly defined by oppression, or singularly defined by the violence, whether state sanctioned or interpersonal, that is enacted or attempted to be enacted against us. And I was like, my life is so much more robust than that, right? My life is so much more three-dimensional than that. Every Black person's life is so much more three-dimensional than that. And I wanted the book to reflect the sort of confluence of emotional textures that made my life what it is. So, and I think, and that make any human's life what it is, right? So I was writing this book in a time when I was experiencing a lot of despair that Black people were being killed at the hands of the state. And I also met the woman who would become my wife. And so I was falling in love. And so, like, what does it mean to be a person in the world who is experiencing what feels like this almost cognitive dissonance of feeling despair from the larger society, but also experiencing this, like, one of the most remarkable things you can experience as a person, which is to, like, meet someone and fall in love with that person, and to have your sense of who you are in the world shifted by another person. And these things were happening at the same time. And so I was like, I want to honor that in my work. Like, I want these poems to be sort of reflective of what was happening in my own interiority, which is to say, like, thinking about what was happening in the outside world, but also thinking about what was happening in my own sort of small world. And then how are these things in conversation with each other? And so, there are poems about falling in love that are also sort of situated between these moments of despair. But that's how I experience the world, right? Like, that's how all of us experience the world. We are never singularly experiencing despair or singularly experiencing joy. It is always some gradation, some entanglement, some confluence of all of those things. And I also wanted the book to reflect the idea, just to push further on that idea that although Black Americans have been subjected to centuries of intergenerational violence, again, we are not defined by that, and that there is still agency, and there is still and that we still have agency, and that how remarkable is it that in spite of this centuries long history of oppression, that we have, like, built communities, that we have created a culture so grounded in love, that we have created social infrastructure and social enterprises and social institutions that make our lives so rich, and so important. And so, that's a long way of saying I wanted the book to reflect my own way of thinking, because I was, like, so set on what was happening. I was so angered by it and felt so tied to it. And then I had to sort of release myself from that, just personally, between two, because this book is written between 2014 and 2016. And so the journey the book takes, from, like, experiencing despair to then at the end, I think, saying we are not defined by that despair, we're not defined by that violence, is an attempt to, capture what was happening in my own spirit in some ways.
Yeah, I was thinking about how many writers say that writing itself kind of saves them.
Mm.
The fact that you're putting the words down. In one of your poems, you said, "I've always used words to try and convince the world that I'm worth something," which was just such a powerful thought. Like, you're writing more for yourself than you're writing for all of us.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think that that goes two ways, right? So I think it's both, and this is what I love about poems, is that, like, you write a line like that, and it is you can start a poem trying to answer a question, and you don't have to answer the question by the end of that poem. You might have more questions, and that's one of the things I love about the form, is that it doesn't necessitate a thesis statement, or it doesn't necessitate like a having come to a conclusion necessarily, or you can come to a conclusion, or even when you do seemingly come to a conclusion, because that statement in and of itself seems like a conclusive statement. It within that statement is a sort of internal grappling, right? So like in that line, I think about, that line is based thinking about spelling bees that I did in elementary school. Um, and so it's part of this is like the way that I used words to sort of try to find an identity for myself in the classroom, and to sort of create in the way that young people do all the time. You try to find the thing that helps you stand out, but also like the affirmation and love from my parents, right? Like, and how that was entangled in scholastic success, and how when I was younger, I wondered if it was contingent. It's not. I love my parents; they love me. It's not contingent on that. But like these are the things, when you're a child, you're like, you're so desperate to please your parents, and then even now, it's become a more sort of like grappling with the relationship between like sort of like capitalistic notions of productivity, and like how what we create so often defines who we are, especially in like a social media age, and just like being a person in the world, in America, where our definitions of self are like really wrapped up in what we do or don't produce, and I don't think that's a good thing. But I also wanted to be honest in the poem about the sort of irony of like writing a book, and writing a line that says I've always used words to convince the world that I'm worth something, that like this book in and of itself is an attempt to do that both for the world and for myself, but shouldn't be, right? Like what, is how much of myself is wrapped up in this book, or like the creation of this book. Who am I without the book? Who am I with it? So again, it's another thing about poetry where like I'm speaking almost to three different iterations of myself, or different questions I've grappled with one line. I think that's just a pretty cool opportunity that this art form affords you.
I would agree. And I also, I was really struck by how many ways the poems that are here are echoing other things you'll do, like For Charles and the poem that's from the perspective from the cell block, to me felt like they were almost precursors to this.
Mm,
Like there was this sense of your love of history. When I read your book, which I just think is an incredible book, um, I kept saying to people, poets should write history because you wind us into the imagery. And I gave the copy that I first got to my son to read. And he said every time I was underlining phrases like the whisper of the sound of the leaves, or that it drew him even farther in, my notes were, and that he didn't know if he would have noticed as much
mm,
the imagery and the way that it was working. But I think that part of the magic, it's not just that we don't know this history, it's that you take us on a journey that's very present and in the past. And I think that is part of what you're describing about this creation of these poems, is that the poems are very present with those events, but they also are present now,
mm,
3, 4 years, 5 years later. And that the thing I love is that you'll have these really intimate, beautiful poems that are, you're showing us a little bit of your life that I think is it's brave, and it is very real and very close to who you are. You're offering that as a gift. At the same time, you'll take the cabs going by you in Harvard Square, and you don't write that as an angry poem. It's reflective. Like you may have written first draft angry,
mm,
but it's a very settled, like, this might mean this, and
mm,
cab number 5. And I think that that approach is allows the reader to step back from the anger, because you can't help the anger in some of the pieces, right? And you need to feel that as well. But then you have these moments, almost like Shakespearean relief, the comedy that comes in. You give us these moments of rest and peace. And I think that's what I was thinking about, is the whole collection. Like it's not chronological, right?
mm. No, no, it's not.
And I love that idea of how you selected and decided on where they would go. together, how the poems would talk to each other. So the question at the end of all that rambling is that you're talking to teachers, and you were a teacher. I love Aristotle when you talk about being 25 and in a classroom. And I had my students choose one collection to read. We read poetry almost every day.
Mm,
But I think we really miss something with only giving kids individual poems.
mm,
I mean, I have many, many, many poems that I share, but they're all individuals, and then they miss the feel of the collection.
mm.
What do you think about that as a teacher?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think that we're in such a unique and special moment, I think, where there are so many people who I feel lucky to call friends and peers and colleagues who are uh, putting work out into the world that I think is like helping young people reconceptualize what they thought poetry was supposed to look like, or who they thought poets were supposed to be. Because when I was a kid, I was like, oh, poets are all dead people. Like
Mhm.
they were the poets, they existed, and now we're studying them. I had no notion of a poet being someone who like went to the grocery store, or like, like at this, played sports, or um came from the communities that I came from. And I think it's so amazing, and I think so many of us are so grateful to so many of the educators who are teaching poets who are young and alive and of color, um, and many of whom came from a sort of performance poetry background. Right, I think that's another fascinating thing about this, is that so many of the people whose work exists in now in classrooms in ways that are being studied are people who, I was with at open mics 15 years ago, that I was with at poetry slams 12 years ago, and that space, I think, was it served as a community, like a real literary community for us when we were trying to figure out who we were as writers, um, and and I think part of why I bring that up is that teaching an entire collection from somebody like Safia Ahulo, or Elizabeth Acevedo, or Dinesh Smith, or Eve Ewing, um, or the list goes on and on, um, that you gain a sort of, there's something to be said for like gaining a more holistic sense of how the writer sees the world, and how that manifests itself through the speaker of their poems, whether they are the speaker or not. And like I said before, I think it also affords the opportunity to realize that like a poem is part of an ecosystem, right? Like a poem, it's one thing to read like a Langston Hughes poem, and it's another thing to read that poem as part of like the larger collection that it's emerging from, and to study the historical context of the moment from which it's emerging, to think about what other writers are writing in that same moment. And I think it's the same thing today. Like it's, I read a poem by Hanif Abdurraqib, and like you read one poem and it's brilliant, but then you read the entire collection and you're like, I have a more full, robust understanding of this person's sensibilities, of this person's question. Like, what are the questions they're interested in? What are the questions they're wrestling with? What are they grappling with internally? And and I think that that's just so valuable, because it it just gives us a more, it is, you just have, instead of getting sort of just like dipping your foot into the water, you get to sort of submerge yourself, and I think that that is provides you with a much more intimate sense of what the poems are trying to do and what the writer is trying to do with the poems.
Mm. Were you talking about A Fortune for My Disaster?
I mean, honestly, with Khalif, I could be talking about anything. I could, if he wrote down his McDonald's order on a piece on a
I
napkin,
know. I
it would, that would count too. I mean, everything that man writes. I mean, they're all over here. But Fortune for My Disaster, obviously. Um,
uh, I just
and then he, his nonfiction, which is basically poems, just like long poems. Yeah, I think that there's, and like, and even reading, I'd be interested. It's interesting because my book just came out 6 weeks ago, but even, reading, like you read Counting Descent and you also read How the Word is Passed, and you're almost, it's interesting because I've not read Counting Descent in its totality in years now. And so you're probably actually able to put the work and conversation together in ways that I might miss, right? I was like, oh, I guess in some ways, like From the Cell Block was like the questions I wrestle with in the chapter of Angola
Mhm.
are, you see the beginnings of that in a
Right.
poem like In the Cell Block. You see the beginning of that in the poems like Beyond This Place. And they're sort of expanded on and grappled with in a different
Yeah.
literary and sort of socio-political context in the nonfiction book. So I think putting people's not only their poems in conversation within a collection, but also um, their different books, if they have them in conversation with each other.
Well, I think that's part of what teachers wrestle with is how to define poetry as a genre when it crosses into nonfiction and it crosses into all these. We try to put things into boxes,
Yeah.
and they don't really. And that's why I think there is a conversation between the two of these. But part of this is because not only I read poetry almost every day just to get myself writing, the way you talked
Mm.
about, like it just springs something in me that helps me write. But this one I listened to on Audible, which
Mm.
was really, I mean, I always think listening to a poet read their work is very different than reading it, but I think spoken word is yet another level. And you were 2014, wasn't it? 2014 National Poetry Slam winner.
Yeah. Yeah. I was part of the
Wow.
DC team that won the National Poetry Slam in 2014.
Because my students respond to spoken word more than any poetry I put in front of them.
Mm.
There's it's something about the combination of you almost know the poet, you can see them
Mhm.
react in the moment that I think is so powerful.
Yeah. And I think that I felt the same way growing up. I mean, I think that I was an English major at Davidson College, and I was struggling. I was a kind of disillusioned English major. We were reading Chaucer and Keats and Yeats and like shout out to my man Chaucer, but like it was hard in part because I thought that that is what poetry had to look like. I
Mhm.
thought that if I don't write like Keats, if I don't write like Yeats, if I don't write like Frost, if I don't write like Whitman, then I'm not a poet, right? Like that is what poetry is, and that is what it looks like. And it wasn't until I went to the New Eureka Poets Cafe the summer of 2008, when I had an internship in New York City. I went to the New Eureka Poetry Cafe on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is this legendary poetry cafe, an incredible poetry community. And I went, and I was in this room full of like all these young people and all these black and brown people and all of these queer people and all of these people who just looked so different than what I thought poets were supposed to look like. And they got on stage and they did these poems that felt alive, right? Like I could see it in the poem was coming from their mouths, but it was also coming from their bodies. Like it was the entirety of who they were was the poem, and the way that they controlled how we experience the poem based on like how fast they read or how slow they went, um, when their volume increased, when it decreased, when it felt like you were sort of creating a crescendo with your tongue. I mean, it was just, I was like, I don't know what this is, but I want to do it. And I think it also provided this amazing thing where it became more clear the way that poetry and literature more broadly exist as both a mirror and a window, because people would get up on that stage and do poems. Another black man would get on that stage and do a poem about being a black man in America that felt like it said, where he said all of the things that I wish I could have said but never knew how. And that was a mirror, and it felt so resonant. And then there were people like, I think about the first one, the poem by a woman who got up on stage and did a poem about having living with cerebral palsy. And disability was never something at the forefront of my consciousness. I never thought actively about it, but in 3 minutes away, I thought about an entire demographic of people like completely changed. And I was like, I'd never been so moved by art as I had. And so that was a sort of window into someone else's experience in a way that we know literature has the ability to do. And it is a really incredible way to help students gain an entry point into poetry, and to help them understand too that like it's not like spoken word is here and poetry is over here, right? Like this is poetry. This is in many ways the sort of part of a more, I won't say more, but the tradition of poetry is an oral one, right? Like,
Mhm.
Homer wasn't somebody who was sitting around like writing on long scrolls of paper and saying like, haha, I can't wait for these kids to read the Odyssey in ninth grade English. Like it was a story that was passed down from person to person. It was this epic poem, this epic ode that was passed down. Um, in the same, Shakespeare in the same way, when he was writing, most people in England at that period of time were illiterate. Nobody was reading Romeo and Juliet. Nobody was reading, like, it was something that was meant to be performed aloud in the Globe Theater, to be experienced um, in person, to hear and to see the people, even the poems, even when people read the poems. And that's why they call him like the bard, right? Because it was meant to be received audibly. And so, it is both a recognition that this might serve as a unique entry point for young students into this world, and also a recognition that they are not mutually exclusive. It is not like the page or the stage, and that, in fact, the tradition of literature was an oral one until the mid 15th century, when the printing press was invented, right? And so we should take that tradition seriously, um, and recognize that, like, whether you're reading Counting Descent or hearing me on stage, um, they are different iterations of the same thing. Because I can do things on the page that I can't do on stage, right? I can do something with a line break that makes you read the book in a different way. And I can also, when I'm on stage, do something with my voice that makes you experience the poem in a different way. So I think each of them have and afford the reader something special and unique. And I think for me, I love when I hear a poet and then read their work, because I can almost like hear their voice emerging from the page. So yeah, I think there's a lot of possibility with sort of mixing things up that way.
But I just want to go one step farther, and that is that my students don't just, in writing next to poetry, learn that they can be poets. They discover something about themselves as writers, period.
Mm,
Poetry is so immediate, and there's voice, and there's a way in for them that they'll often say, I had no idea I could write like this.
mm,
And it's next to poetry. So I feel like it's this window, this important place where teachers as writers and students as writers find a way to words and ideas, because there's poetry is just so present and vivid, and yours in particular. Do you have a poem? Because we're at the end of our time, which kills me because I could talk to you for so
oh
long. And
man,
I'm
it goes
hoping
by
to
so
have a
quickly.
reading coming up in Boston once we're back to doing something so I can come and listen.
Yeah.
But
So,
will you close with a poem? Something you'd be willing to read?
yeah. I'll do the last poem of the book. There is a lake here, after Jamal May. There is a lake here, a lake the size of outstretched arms. And no, not the type of arms raised in surrender. I mean the sort of arms beckoning to be held, to wrap themselves around one another and never let go. And no, the lake is not a place where people are drowning. And no, this water is not that which comes from a storm, or that which turns a city into a tessellation of broken windows and spray paint. There are children swimming here, splashing one another while the droplets ricochet between them. The droplets do not hurt, they simply roll down the side of the boy's cheek. No, the boy is not using the water to hide his tears. He is laughing, eyes cast out across the water, in awe of how vast it is.
What a beautiful, beautiful poem of promise. Thank you so much for your time. I just, as someone who inspires me so much, and I hope that the entire book club picks this up and reads it, because it is, I think, going to win the Pulitzer Prize. I think it's going to be this. I know I'm forecasting here. It is honestly, Clint, it just not only defines the questions we all need to grapple with for this country. If this country's going to survive, it's going to survive because people like you said, look at who we are, and in a way that allows us to experience that. So I'm just grateful. I hope to see you perform at some point, and have a great rest of your week. Thanks for starting us off so well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.